What carburetor is best right out of the box? Is it the Edelbrock or is it the Holley? Today we're going to talk about that myth and we're going to see if it's confirmed or busted by the facts of how tuning goes. So stay tuned. So if you read internet forums, Facebook pages, Instagram, whatever, you will literally find hundreds of people that say, I bolted this on right out of the box and it was perfect. You will literally find that everywhere you go. When you look at reviews of carburetors, when you look at Facebook groups or Instagram posts on certain things, it is literally one of the biggest myths that's out there when it comes to carburation. And today we're going to figure out if that's true or not. And if it is, what is the percentage of these carburetors that will bolt and work on something like that? And is there any fact to it? And is there any falsehoods to that? If you bolt on one of these carburetors, are they good right out of the box for a certain application, for all applications, for most applications? Well, that's what we're going to figure out today. But first, we're going to talk about the tuning process and how that works, and then we're going to look at these carburetors individually and see which one is better. Now, if you've watched any of my carburetor videos before, you know what's coming up next, and that's talk about the fuel system. Again, if you do not get this right, if you don't have the right filters, if you don't have a good pressure regulator, if you don't have everything dialed in properly on this side, it doesn't matter what carburetor you put on there, nothing is going to run perfectly. So this is going to make the assumption that your fuel system is correct for the application that you're working on, and your ignition system is set properly for what you're working on. We're going to always make that assumption when talking about this, and this is not any different when we're talking about carburetors. So what do you do when you buy a carburetor? What you are actually doing is you are buying whatever CFM fits closely to what you are working on. Whether it's a drag car, whether it's a dedicated track car for autocross or road racing, or whether it's just a street driver, whether you've got nitrous on there, whether you've got an upgraded exhaust system by compression ratio, altitude of what you're driving at, cubic inches, how aggressive the cam profile, all of those things affect what carburetor you purchase. And obviously it's going to also affect how you tune the carburetor. Different situations demand a different type of carburetor, even on the exact same engine. The exact same engine that may be a 454 cubic inch big block that's a naturally aspirated street driven engine, the exact same engine, if you take it and throw a 250 shot of nitrous at it, may take a different carburetor. So all of those things come into mind when you're choosing a size of carburetor. And we'll talk about that down the road, how to select the best size carburetor for what you're working on. But today we want to talk about which one of these carburetors is best right out of the box. Which one is closest to perfect right out of the box, like the internet tells us that there are some of these that are perfect. So let's talk a little bit about that. How does the manufacturer put these together and calibrate them to where they are so perfect right out of the box for every application that's out there? So these all these carburetors, whether it's a Holley, whether it's the Edelbrock, Demon, whatever, they are typically wet flowed by the manufacturer to see how they flow fuel and how they flow CFM, air volume, through the carburetor, and then they base the tune off of that. So let's take a 600 CFM carburetor, for example. They may look at that 600 and say, okay, let's look at the most common application out there. 350 Chevy, mild cam, dual plane intake, factory compression ratio, headers, automatic transmission with no stall converter. That is probably the most universal application out there. There are literally hundreds of thousands of those probably out on the road that are in that certain configuration. They're in four-wheel drive trucks. They're in little tiny street rods. They're in little muscle cars or factory type cars that have that type of configuration. The manufacturer will set that carburetor based on that, and they will rod and jet it or jet it and power valve it based on that application. And so when they go to select a carburetor for that application, they'll tell you, well, this 600 CFM is set for that application, that mild Chevrolet engine with those specifics, cam profile, compression ratio, everything. That's how they set that up. Now, in that instance, you may be able to bolt on one of these 600 CFM carburetors and it may run perfectly. You may not have any calibration that you have to do. But is that always the case? Well, it's hard to say because even with so many of those out there, does that work every time? I don't know. So let's talk a little bit about what happens when you buy the carburetor for your application. Obviously, the first thing you're going to do is get it out of the box, inspect it, make sure there's no damage to the carburetor at all. Next thing you're going to do, doesn't matter what brand of carburetor, is set the float levels. You don't want to overfuel anything, and you don't want fuel gushing out of the top of them. And what I've seen a lot of times, doesn't matter what brand it is, the floats will be the thing that gets the most jacked up in shipping. They bounce around, they can get a little bent, and so you need to set the float levels perfectly on both. Now the Holley is a little bit easier to do that if the floats are in good shape. The Edelbrock's a little bit more complicated, but the process is the same. Set the float level to where it needs to be. Next thing you're going to do, obviously, is you're going to make sure that your pressure regulator is set for whatever brand carburetor. Edelbrock likes 6 pounds and no more. The Holley, I think you can push a little bit higher, 6.5, 7 sometimes, whatever. But either way, whatever your preference is on whatever brand carburetor you're going to do. Next thing you're going to do is you're going to roughly set the idle air mixture screws to make sure that they are as close to what the factory setting should be. Now, Holley typically tells you to screw them all the way in till they lightly seat, then go out a turn and a half. Edelbrock's pretty much the same, but doesn't matter. You just want to make sure that these are set. There is no magical adjustment on these idle mixture screws. People monkey with these way, way too often. It's not some magical little tuning piece to make things run perfectly. Turn and a half out, you're pretty much done at that point. You may tweak it a little bit here or there, but for the most part, let it go. Next thing you're going to do is you're going to set the idle speed screw. And this, again, is kind of a guesstimate. Now, the best way to do that on any carburetor is just to make sure that the choke plates are closed all the way. You screw the idle speed screw open a little bit till these just touch and start to open. Then I typically back it off just a little bit. You don't want too much speed in there. Once you fire up the engine for the first time, you'll get that all set. Now, if this is an electric choke carburetor, then obviously you're going to set that next and make sure that the choke plate is where you want it for the condition that you're working on. Then at that point, it's bolting it on, hooking up your fuel lines, and start the normal tuning process from there. And that's where we get into the situation where people say, well, you know, I bought this carburetor and it was perfect right out of the box. Again, you'll see hundreds and thousands of people express that online, hear it at the drag strip, hear it in conversation, bench race, and whatever. Is that the fact at this point? From right there, when you bolt that thing on after doing those little minor little adjustments to it, is everything else perfect to that point? Well, let's take a look at that. Now, this happens to be the last Holley carburetor that I bought for a big block Chevy. The factory settings on this carburetor, primary jet is a 71, secondary is an 85, front has a 6.5 power valve, and I think they're both 31 on the squirter size. Now, again, from the factory, we have the factory settings here at 2800 and 6500, which is the 2 RPM ranges that I typically try to tune at. 14.97, 15.9. We are a little lean. So out of the box, this carburetor, 800 CFM on I believe the final compression ratio on this was right at 10.4. We'll call it 10.5 to 1. 282, 291 on the cam. 560, 570 lift, somewhere like that on the lift, on a 110 with about 4 degrees of advanced ground into it from the manufacturer. Fairly aggressive street big block. 800 was about as big as I wanted to go because this was an NA motor, no nitrous, no boost, nothing funky with it, but that carburetor should have been pretty close right out of the box. I could have used an 850 or a 950 on it, but it would have been too much carburation, too much CFM for what that engine was based on and the driving that it was going to get done on it. So out of the box, we looked at 71 jet and 85 in the rear, and those AFR ratings, we have to start tuning from there. And this process, it was a 4-tune jet change on both sides, and I didn't change the squirters until this last spot down here to get me to a final AFR at 2800 of 13.1 and at 6500 12.5 to 1. Now on a NA motor, that's not bad. It is a little fat on the fuel side at 6500, but that's okay. You want a little bit more fuel up there. You definitely don't want to run out of it, have the ignition start cooking things. So did this 800 CFM carburetor work right out of the box? It was okay, but it was a little lean. It stumbled a little bit, if I remember correctly, and it just needed a little bit more tuning to get it done properly. Now, had I gone a little bit further, I may have ended up changing the power valve. I may have ended up changing the squirters a little bit earlier in the tuning process, but as that set in a 4-step process there to get to where I wanted to be on the AFR side, that's where I ended up. 78 on the primary jet, 100 in the secondaries. Again, it gave me the AFR that I wanted, so everything ended up being perfect as far as I was concerned with this. Again, I could have tuned a little bit more on it to get it better, but for the most part, I was satisfied with it. Now let's talk about this Edelbrock carburetor. This was a 500 CFM carburetor that I used on a customer's 283 Powerglide car. Very, very mild engine. Didn't really need a lot of tuning, but quite honestly, this was really about the smallest carburetor I wanted to go with. I could have run a 390 Holley CFM carburetor on here, and it probably would have been a little bit better because they weren't really using all 500 of those CFM, but it just happened to be the smallest carburetor that I could get my hands on at the time, and it ended up being pretty good. I don't have the exact tuning process that I went through and what calibration that it finally ended up in, but I do know that I looked at multiple rod and jet changes to get to where I wanted to be. And when we look at the tuning chart for that carburetor, I don't remember where it ended up being, but I know that I was a little lean. I had to go a little lean on the cruise mode and a little lean on the power mode to get it dialed in with the right AFR. Again, this was a street cruiser, very, very mild, factory 283 car. I think it was a 9-to-1 compression engine. Didn't have much of a cam in it. 252, I think, was a duration on probably a 450 lift. I don't remember what the LSA on it. It was fairly tight at a 106 or a 107, somewhere down there. But for the most part, this carburetor was really close out of the box, but it did need a few rod and jet changes to get us down to where it was the correct AFR at those two power ranges, those two RPM ranges, 2800, 6500. On the 283, we're a little limited on the RPM range because, quite honestly, that engine doesn't see north of 5,000, 5,500 at all. So really, it changes a little bit of the process, but it doesn't change the outcome. You still have to tune for AFR wherever your max RPM is, and that really just over idle when you start to get into the power circuit of the car at 2,800 RPM. So I think you can pretty much see where we're going with here. Did either one of these carburetors work on either one of those applications right out of the box? Yes. I could bolt them up, fire it up, set that basic tune with the RPM or speed screw, the basic idle mixture screws, and just another quick visual inspection to make sure there was nothing else was wrong. And in this case, it didn't have an electric choke on either carburetor, so there wasn't that. But once that was set, these carburetors still needed tuning to get the AFR correct for what you're working on. Now, again, I could have bolted on that 800 onto that big block and ran it. It would have been a little lean. Customer probably would have been very happy with it, and there would have been no issue with it. But was it correct? Absolutely not. Was there more power to be made in it? Absolutely yes. And again, I don't have dyno results for either one of these engines because we didn't dyno either one of them, but we certainly tuned them for drivability and power, and both of them required jet and rod changes in the Edelbrock carburetor and certainly in the Holley carburetor as well. So let's answer that question right now. Is there one of these carburetors that is better right out of the box? Or let's ask a bigger question, is any carburetor good right out of the box? The answer to that question is no, absolutely not. Definitely not. You have to tune for what you are working on. You have to tune for your application. The manufacturers of these carburetors have no idea what they're getting bolted on. They have no idea what engine it's going on, what cubic inches, what compression ratio. There is far too many variables in there that you have to account for to make sure that you get these tuned right. In this case, neither one of these engines would have been hurt by leaving it alone, but in the 283's example, it would have been overfueled. In the 800 CFM on the 454, it would have been lean. So you have to tune for the application. I know that sounds really cool on the internet when guys say, yeah, bolted on right out of the box, everything was awesome, and I drove it. It's because you did not tune it. You got nothing out of it. You didn't get the full benefit of either one of those carburetors for what you were working on. Did it work right out of the box? Yeah, probably, but you're also the guy that probably doesn't check his ignition very often, has his timing set incorrectly, and then goes online and barks that the Edelbrock Carburetor's garbage, the Holley's floods everything, and they're horrible as well. Both these carburetors have their space, but you have to tune them for what it goes on. The manufacturer has no idea what is going on. They will set a base tune for what they think it would be perfect with, and that's it. It's up to you to do all the tuning at that point. So when we get down to it, you're going to have to tune these carburetors. It's just the way it is. It's not an EFI system where you can set a few parameters, turn on a self-learning mode, and try to start working through all that way. You have to set these. They're an analog piece. They're not going to tune themselves, and they are not going to adjust themselves. You have to do that for it. And by doing that is to properly tune it. So the myth is busted as far as I'm concerned. There was never any question about it. You have to tune these carburetors or you are not going to get the benefit out of them. Or in some cases, you may end up hurting things, especially if you were to take that carburetor that was on the big block and throw a big shot of nitrous, even 120, 125 shot of nitrous on it. You were way too lean at it. Even with the nitrous dumping more fuel on a wet system, that is still way too lean of a carburetor. You have to tune for what you're working on. So can you do that right out of the box? Sure. Is it right? Absolutely not. You have to tune these carburetors. So as always, if you have any questions about this, please don't hesitate. Leave them down below. I certainly appreciate a thumbs up or a thumbs down on the video, whichever you got out of it. If you thought it was cool, hey, give me that thumbs up. And as always, please subscribe. And if you have any questions, again, don't hesitate. Leave them down below. I'd love to answer anything that you have on tuning on either one of these carburetors. And hey, I think we just proved, at least on this video anyway, that I do own a Holley. I'm not just an Edelbrock guy completely. Carburetors are situational, and every carburetor has its purpose depending on what you're working on. So anyway, that's it, guys. We'll talk to you on the next video. And again, if you have any questions, leave them down below. We'll see you.